To round off season 9 of the Old Front Line, there'll be a couple of shorter bonus episodes prior to a summer break, and the podcasts will return in early September. These bonus episodes give me a chance to talk about subjects that aren't always big enough for a standalone major episode, but nevertheless perhaps of interest to a wider audience. In this one, we'll talk about mapping the Old Front Line. For me, maps are the currency of history. If you're an historian that doesn't understand maps, you can't really understand history. Now, we've spoken about trench maps before on the podcast, and there is definitely a full episode about that, but I was thinking recently as I was getting ready to walk a Ledger Battlefields group around the Ypres salient, how mapping and the use of maps on those Great War battlefields has changed, both in and during the war, and since the conflict too. And this is relevant because in this podcast we often discuss landscape, and it's impossible to fully read any landscape without maps. This was something that I learned in my youth, really, as I began to walk the chalk downlands of Sussex. Those magenta purple covered Ordnance Survey maps of that period absolutely fascinated me. Sitting at home, poring over the maps, looking at every feature on that landscape that I was going to walk, and then taking them onto the downs above Worthing or into the Cuckmere Valley, and to see how those ink lines on a map and symbols translated into a real-world environment was an absolute revelation. So when I first set foot on the Somme in 1982, walking the battlefields with my dad, maps were amongst the very first things that I picked up when I was there. In those days, there was a Maison de la Presse in the main square in Albert, directly opposite the Basilica, and in the window there were many of Martin Middlebrook's books, one of which, First Down the Somme, I already had, and I didn't know that he was a friend of the bookshop owner, and that's how his books came to be in their window in France. It was one of those kind of oldie, worldy Maison de la Presses. There was stationery and pens and paper and all kinds of paraphernalia everywhere. Magazines, which has always been a big thing in France, including back then a lot of First World War ones, as there are today. But there at the back were these racks and racks of maps. And the maps that I realised that would be useful to me were not the big scale ones covering the whole of northern France or the department of the Somme, but the Blue Series IGN maps, the Institut Géographique National, France's equivalent of the Ordnance Survey. And these were maps that are today at 1 to 25,000 scale, with 1 centimetre equaling 250 metres. There were 2 main sheets for the Somme, one covering the area around Albert, the other Bapaume, and you could kind of put these together to cover the whole front. And they went from obviously east to west as well as from north to south, and if you put the sheets together, then you had basically that 1916 battlefield area where the Battle of the Somme had taken place. And these were used by me on that very first trip to walk, as we did in that summer of 1982, from Albert up to Bapaume Post, the first cemetery that I went to on the Somme, up over the rise of the Tara-Usna Hills, down into La Boisselle. We didn't really know where everything was, so we carried on via the Lochnagar crater up to Pozières, and then at Pozières we saw the Pozières British Cemetery and Memorial, turned off and headed up towards Thiepval, and then the Newfoundland Park, we got as far as that, and then backtracked on ourselves down to Hamel, and then that long trek through Avalui Wood, which seemed never ending, and back into Albert. Now that was quite a walk, and my dad had only just retired. You know, he was in his 60s then, a veteran of the Second World War, but it had a profound effect on me, as I've discussed many times on this podcast. It launched me on that journey that I continue to this day, but it took me across the Somme and around the Somme and through those different layers of the Somme. But the maps that I had with me that first gave me insight into what was there and what was around me were so important, and I realized that they could tell me a lot more besides. So when I got back, I understood a bit more of the ground now, having seen it. I knew I had bonded with it in the same way as I'd done with the Downs in Sussex, and sitting at my parents' kitchen table in our Crawley council house, I spent many a happy evening poring over these Blue Series IGN maps, thinking about what I'd seen, what that meant in terms of the history as I read more and more about it, and also what I could see next time, because even though we'd done those long walks, we hadn't covered everything, far from it. And I could see, as I read more about it, the importance of this village and that wood and this area of the Somme battlefield. So as much as looking at those maps taught me, I felt frustrated as well, because what I really wanted to do was to somehow not just look at the map and understand the modern landscape, but to tap into that landscape of the past and understand that too. So I wanted to somehow overlay where the trenches had been onto these maps, but how to do it. My book collection was small then, and while the local library in Crawley had some good volumes and I made much use of it, none of them really had the detailed enough maps for me to be able to do this, to be able to overlay that kind of information onto modern detailed maps of the battlefields today. And then, having recently joined the Western Front Association, a copy of Stand 2 one day arrived with some back issues, and then I began to read about trench maps. Now, this was a new phrase to me, trench maps. What were these trench maps? And that discovery took me down a massive rabbit hole, going to see original trench maps at the Public Records Office, the PRO as it was then. Many of those maps were dusty, they were still covered in Somme mud in some cases, and there was a good collection in the Imperial War Museum, so I used to go to the Dome reading room at the IWM, used to go up the little stairs into that Dome room, and you could order stuff up and it would be delivered to your table, and I sat there looking at maps, and I began to discover what trench maps were, and more importantly, what they can tell us. So what are trench maps? So when the British Army went to war in 1914, it obviously had maps. Every European army had purchased map data before the war to produce maps, and they were of all kinds of scales, not particularly detailed, and the British maps were based on European map data, which is why the contours and the distances were in metres and kilometres, not in feet and miles and yards. So the maps that the British Army took to war were few in number and not as detailed and useful as they could be. Something that in the War of Movement in August and September of 1914 didn't really matter, as long as you could get from Le Cateau to Beauhain or from Amiens up to the railhead or whatever it was, then these maps were of some use. But once the war went static on the Aisne in September 1914, when the Germans pulled back to the Aisne heights, began to dig in, and the British, for example, did likewise, some of the first trenches were dug there, then mapping suddenly became very important. And the maps that they had were not detailed enough, for example, to really cover the wooded area above Soupir on that Aisne height, so typical of those parts of the front line then in that September-October 1914 period. So the British Army, having trained its officers in the ability to create maps, what you saw then were sketch maps, improvised maps made by the officers themselves, and many of those are in the war diaries of that period. And it's something that you see in the fighting around Ypres and La Bassée on into October, November of 1914 as well. So it was clear that the maps that were there were not adequate, and the sketch maps were okay, but they were not as detailed as they could be, and they couldn't be used by a wider army. So a mapping unit was brought over. We'll discuss them a little bit further into the podcast, and the first trench maps were created. Now, the map data that was used, it was quickly realised, was inaccurate. So when it said that a hill was 60 metres above sea level, it could be 65, 67, 68. And that mattered if you were trying to throw shells over it. The artillery wouldn't be calibrated properly, and the shells would hit the hill rather than going over the top of it. So these new Royal Engineer units that arrived began to properly map and survey the battlefield, and that led to the production of the first so-called trench maps. Now we'll come back to trench maps later on, but first, what did access to these maps help me to do with those old Blue Series French maps that I had? Once I got access to the trench maps, what did I do with that information? Well, getting photocopies and sitting there at the same kitchen table, I was able to trace the outline of trenches, add the names and positions of key defences, and eventually overlay where certain battalions, brigades, divisions had been, and turn the maps from a simple terrain guide into something much, much more. Now today, to a modern audience, to those of you listening to the podcast, this probably sounds unimaginable to manually create maps with pens and pencils. And of course it wasn't 100% accurate, but what it helped me to do was begin to imagine the layers of history that cover those battlefields. So when I returned to the battlefield, returned to that old front line, these maps helped me find where the front lines had been. The geography helping to explain why one ridge or field or wood was defended instead of another. So all of that kind of came together really. In some fields, deep ploughed before the winter, for example, the maps led me to places where the white chalk scars visibly showed where the trench lines had once ran during the First World War. It was literally old school research, and it took time and there were mistakes, but each time I learned, and what I think I learned sunk deep, deep into my consciousness because of the way that I did it. Now, well, today it's of course much, much easier. You can plan walking and driving routes on Google Maps. So much of the information about what is on the landscape of the First World War has been added to Google Maps. Bunkers and cemeteries and memorials and positions and the sites of former places that are no longer there. So you can data mine that for information to plan your battlefield walks. You can set it up to do a driving route, to do a walking route. And of course, I've used those maps on the podcast website whenever we've done a virtual walk together. So it's an incredibly, incredibly useful tool. I've been using it since the very beginning. I've added a lot of places to that map landscape myself, and it's something that I use all the time, almost every day. So it's an incredibly useful tool. You can also use something that we've spoken about on the podcast before. You can use Great War Digital Linesman. Now, this is a piece of technology that has turned the First World War trench maps and turned them into GPS-orientated maps, so that you can use a device like a tablet with the maps on it, with a GPS receiver, and you can stand in a field on the Somme at Ypres, no matter where it is, around Arras on the Hindenburg line, and it'll tell you where you are, and you can pinpoint that on the First World War landscape. So you can stand there and see that a trench ran off to your left and a trench ran off to your right. There were bunkers over there. I mean, all kinds of information. I've been using that since it first came out. I bought the first version of it, I think in 2008. A group of us battlefield guys got together and we purchased a whole set of these things and we used them. There was a little tiny kind of PDA handheld device with a small screen that you used to look at the maps. Now you can use iPads and all kinds of things. Now you can have it on your desktop to plan routes. Again, it's incredibly useful, and I've used it for quite a few of my walking books to plan the routes, plot them out on the French series maps, and then see what that looks like on the First World War landscape. And that's really, really useful. Now, you have to buy Great War Digital, but it is a really, really good investment. I don't have shares in it. An old friend of mine, school friend, runs that company now, Steve Chambers, but it's a really useful bit of kit, and I can't recommend it enough. If you're not in an opportunity to buy Great War Digital's Linesman at the moment, what you can use, which is free, is the Western Front Association's Trench Mapper site. Now, this is a map portal that the Western Front Association has put online. You can access it through their main website, and it opens up at Ypres, and it overlays a map, and you can search locations. You can put in trench map references. You can work your way down the front. It's got, I suspect thousands of map sheets on it, from the smallest kind of scale right up to the bigger ones, with not just British maps on there, but German and French and Belgian maps. Incredibly useful site, and all plaudits to the Western Front Association for putting this online, because it is incredibly useful. And it works with Google Maps, so you can use a little slider to go backwards and forwards, so you can look at the trench map and then move the slider and it shows you the modern landscape, so you can see where things are. Now, it's not as useful as some of the others, but as a free tool online to use anywhere, you could use it in a field on the Somme. For example, if you've got a data signal on your phone, then it's incredibly useful for that, and well worth having a look at and explore. And of course, all of this is a great improvement, much more accurate than my early sketches, but still not quite the same, but perhaps accessible because of how modern and vibrant it is to a much wider audience. But circling back to those trench maps, which I essentially used as the data back then, and many of these more modern systems, of course, also use them, what of the trench maps that were used by the British Army in the First World War? Maps had helped revolutionise warfare, giving commanders insight into what a battlefield might look like before they got there, where they might place their forces, and as maps improved, this only added to their ability to plan before they entered combat with the enemy. During the Great War, what was the purpose of maps used on and off the battlefields? There were maps for commanders and staff planners, so they could see the front line that was going to be fought over, look for vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and the best place to launch a major strike against a part of the line to achieve the objectives of that operation. Staff planners, then once a plan had been formulated, staff planners would use the maps to set up corps and divisional areas so that troops could be amassed, resources could be amassed, bombardments could be planned. Often there were maps specifically for the gunners, the chief gunners, to then show to the actual units that would fire the bombardment, showing them where their shells would drop, marked in a series of coloured lines that would be drawn onto the map. So these became incredibly useful tools for all of those at the senior level. On the battlefield itself, as we said, in 1914, a lot of people were using hand-drawn maps, and they did continue on and off, but once trench maps became widely available, they weren't really required. So trench maps were, certainly in the early part of the war, 1915, 16, on into 17 a bit, were largely only used by officers. And in most cases, for example, during the Battle of the Somme, very few officers below company level ever received a map. And if you were a platoon commander, you might be shown a map. You could make a sketch of it in your notebook, but you didn't necessarily take a map with you. So as the war progressed and commanders realised that the more information that soldiers had, the better they could perform on the battlefields, then more and more soldiers got trench maps. And as you get into 1917-18, then not just platoon commanders have maps, but platoon sergeants and even some section corporals. And there were certain types of maps that were message maps, where you were going to go into an attack, let's say at Passchendaele, and it shows Cress Farm across to Waterfields up towards the village of Passchendaele, and it's got the whole area mapped in detail, and on the back there's a message section. And if you were being fired at from a particular location and you needed artillery or trench mortar support, then you could annotate the map, show what you required, put the message on the back, and that could be taken by a runner back to the gun positions, and hopefully they would assist you in your advance. So soldiers on the battlefield would use the maps for a number of purposes. And when I interviewed the veterans, what I discovered is that of the ordinary soldiers that I spoke to, which were the majority, the men who'd been in the ranks, very, very few of them had any kind of maps, and very few of them had trench maps. The officers that I interviewed almost always had trench maps, and I've told the story of Malcolm Vivian, gunner officer, who had his maps of Gommecourt, again still with Somme mud on them. Gunners are slightly different. So Malcolm Vivian was a gunner. He was in the Royal Garrison Artillery. There was a much heavier use of maps in the artillery for obvious reasons, because the guns were firing at targets they couldn't necessarily see, and so would need the maps to plan that kind of fire. So a much greater number of maps went to artillery units on the battlefield to help them do their day-to-day jobs of supporting the infantry, of laying down barrages, of whatever it was. So again, gunners, when I interviewed gunners, they often had maps. British mapping, British trench mapping, and what became known as trench maps, was coordinated from the very start by Major, later Lieutenant Colonel, Evan Maclean Jack, CMG DSO of the Royal Engineers, who had the very cool title of Maps at GHQ. That was his title. If you wanted to know anything about maps, you spoke to Maps, Mr. Maps, if you like, and that was Jack, Lieutenant Colonel Jack. His belief was a map is a weapon. And that's a great phrase, a map is a weapon, because the information on that map was potent. It could be used to ascertain where the enemy was, lay down devastating fire. It could be used by infantry soldiers to plan the right route of attack and know the positions that they were taking on and what their strengths and what their weaknesses were. So the map itself, as well as the men going into action with their rifles and their light machine guns and the heavy weapons supporting them, the map itself was a kind of weapon. And Jack, I think, was streets ahead in the concept of how important maps were to the modern soldier. The first Royal Engineer survey units arrived in France in November 1914 to make sense of the developing battlefield on the Western Front as it was at that stage. Using modern survey equipment, most soldiers in the trenches who witnessed them had never seen sappers like this, and they were such a sight, and such a curious sight, that some were actually detained as spies initially and quickly released, I'm pleased to say. Much of their work was initially to not only map this new battlefield that was developing, but specifically help the artillery. Now, again, going back to the gunners, in their tasks of indirect fire and locating enemy artillery positions. So when the gunners had gone to war in 1914, they had been trained to fire over open sights to support infantry on a battlefield on the flanks and directly engage an enemy they could see. Static trench warfare meant that their guns would be back from the battlefield, firing over the positions held by their own men onto enemy positions beyond. So the maps became incredibly important to them to do that kind of task. In 1915-16, these survey mapping units went through a series of name changes, and including the first ranging and survey section in April 1915. They were then joined by the Royal Engineer printing sections to print the maps to become topographical sections, and then in 1916 field survey companies of the Royal Engineers were formed. These surveyed the landscape, used ground survey, air photos, panoramic photographs and other methods to help produce the data necessary to make these maps accurate. It was a complex and involved process, which is why I think the British trench maps were so good. There were 5 field survey companies, later field survey battalions, and by 1918, Jack was presiding over 5,000 officers and men in the survey units. Other field survey companies served in Italy, one in Egypt and Palestine, Salonika, and in Mesopotamia. The mapping work was done by men of the Survey of India, the Indian version of the Ordnance Survey, which had helped map India itself. By the end of the war, some 34 million war maps had been printed by the British, of which over 21 million were printed by the Ordnance Survey itself in Southampton and shipped out to the battlefields. The key scales of the British maps, the trench maps, were 1 to 5,000. They tended to be for specific areas. There's some 1 to 5,000 sheets of Mouquet Farm and Pozières that were used by the Australians and then by the British troops who eventually took Mouquet Farm in October 1916, and you find them in the war diaries of many of those units. The common scale for most trench maps used by men on the battlefield were 1 to 10,000, which covered a specific area, and 1 to 20,000, which covered a slightly bigger area. But the 1 to 10,000 sheets were amongst the most common used on the actual battlefield itself. There were also area maps that covered a much, much bigger area and would normally be used as you were approaching a battlefield on a march or moving from sector to sector. Maps like Lens 11 or Hazebrook 5A. And there were 1 to 40,000 sheets that covered a big area. So there was a 1 to 40,000 sheet that covered pretty much all of the Ypres salient and was used in a lot of post-war unit histories, for example. Initially, German trenches on these maps were shown in red and British in blue. Later that was reversed, and there were secret and non-secret editions. The non-secret editions were the most common ones. The British front line was only shown in an outline. The secret ones showed all of the British trenches. Now for us as battlefield historians, they are the most useful ones, but they were maps that were not meant to be taken onto the battlefield because they obviously revealed all the details of your positions, which you didn't want that falling into the hands of the enemy. You didn't want an officer going up with a secret edition map, and then that night there was a trench raid and he gets nabbed by the trench raiders and dragged back to the German lines, and he's got this fantastic map that tells the Germans everything that they want to know. So secret maps didn't really or shouldn't have got anywhere near the battlefield, and most men on the battlefield had the non-secret ones, which just showed a dotted line or a line where the British forward positions were. Although I've seen many examples of the non-secret editions where the men who had them actually added the details of their trenches to them with pencil or with ink. In comparison, the Germans produced a staggering 775 million maps, according to Peter Chassaud, who's one of the big historians of trench maps, and those German maps covered both the East and the Western Front and other theatres too, and the French, in comparison, produced over 30 million maps. So the Germans produced the most, and that's a study in its own right. And as we've done before, now we've looked at these trench maps, as we've done before, once before on the podcast where we looked at trench maps, let's now look at a couple of maps, and I'll put some images of these maps up onto the podcast website so you can see what I'm talking about. So the first of these maps that I've got assembled in front of me here, I've got 3 maps here, and I've not got a massive collection of First World War trench maps. I've got a few that I've picked up over the years. Back in the day, I used to find them in the dampest corner of a second-hand bookshop. Much more difficult to get them now, and they're not as cheap as they were in those days either. But the first of the 3 maps that I've got is a 1 to 10,000 trench map, that common scale used on the battlefields. And this actually is only half a map. You might hear me kind of the paper in the background as I turn these things around. But it's only half a map. The top half of the map's been basically cut off, and the bottom half shows the battlefield. And it's an interesting map because it shows a part of the battlefield that's of particular interest to me. It's not the Somme, it's northern France. I'm looking at the ground around Richebourg and the Boar's Head, where the South Downs battalions went into action in June of 1916. But this map is not from that period. When I look to the bottom right-hand corner of the map, it says it's produced by the Ordnance Survey, and it's dated July 1918, 1 to 10,000 map, and all of the trenches that are overlaid on it, and it's very, very detailed. It's got trench names, it's got barbed wire positions, trench railways, tramways, all kinds of things. All of it, apart from one tiny corner in the bottom left, all of the trenches are in blue. So this is a 1918 map where the colour of the trenches is reversed. Now, blue earlier in the war would have meant these were British trenches. This now means these are German trenches, and this is ground that had been swept up in the Battle of the Lys in April 1918 and captured by the Germans. So all of this now is in German occupation, which is why all of these trenches are marked in blue. But in this bottom left-hand corner, near to the village of Festubert, there are some trenches in red. And this is this tiny little pocket on this map of a British bastion of the front line that was left around Festubert, just north of Givenchy, where the 55th West Lancs Division had held the line in April 1918. But Festubert had been defended as well. And this was where the British in this sector now faced the Germans. So north of Festubert village, there's Festubert Keep marked on the map. A little bit of red outline going up to the Caillou Keep, and the Caillou Keep north, 2 defensive positions on a crossroads near Brewery Corner, and they're facing the Epinette Post, which has once been behind the British front line in 1915, and looking up towards Chocolat, Menier Corner, beyond that the Boar's Head and Richbourg, and where the South Downers had been 2 years before. So this was the situation in the summer of 1918, and it's a really interesting map because of that, because it shows this kind of snapshot of the rather strange position that the British Army was now in, because those lads who were defended those keeps, those redoubts, those defensive positions near to Festubert, were now in a pocket where the Germans were in front of them, they were to their right, and they were way over to their left towards Balliol as well. So they were very, very much isolated there. And that's, again, what maps can tell you. This small damaged sheet nevertheless tells us the story of this part of the battlefield where there had been so much blood, so much fighting in the earlier period of the war. But now the situation had changed, the Germans had overrun it, and that pocket of red around Festubert was the last corner of the British Army on this map. The full size, the bigger trench map that I've got in front of me at the moment from the Western Front is not a Somme one, not an Ypres one, it's one near Arras. This is Neuville-Vitasse, just to the southeast of Arras, and this is a 1 to 10,000 sheet as well. It's one from March 1917, produced by the Ordnance Survey. That's again down in the bottom right-hand corner of the map. And it shows the German positions in this area to the southeast of Arras, with the German positions in red and the British trenches in blue, formerly French trenches. And the villages that we've got here up in the top left-hand corner is the village of Agny. And then just beyond that is the outskirts of Achicourt. The German positions are around Beaurain, and to the south Mercatel, and then to the east Neuville-Vitasse, which is the village that the map gives its name to, and then down to the right towards the Courgille River, St Martin-sur-Courgille, and then beyond. And what you've got here is an early example of a map showing the Hindenburg Line. This is a fluid situation. In fact, this is March 1917. Pretty much as soon as this map was published, it was out of date because the Germans pulled back from Beaurain and pulled into the new defensive positions that they'd built, which are so visible on this map. Massive trench lines running from the top middle of the map right down through the middle section and across to the southwest corner, and then a secondary line which is it's actually marked Hindenburg Line going across from that area near Telegraph Hill, down round the back of Neuville-Vitasse, and then across towards the Courgille Valley. So what this map shows is the changing situation on the Western Front in that end of the winter, beginning of the spring of 1917, as the Germans have constructed this Hindenburg Line defences, are now ready to pull back into it. That would result in the fighting in this area. This map was the scene of heavy fighting in April and May of 1917, particularly on the 9th of April, when the British attacked in this area, took most of the Hindenburg Line that is marked on this map. And then just to the west of Neuville-Vitasse is the area where the 56th London Division attacked. My old friend Malcolm Vivian, who I've mentioned in this podcast, he was here as a gunner officer, as a forward observer, and just up the road from him, in a position somewhere on this map, was Edward Thomas, the war poet, also directing the guns of his Royal Garrison artillery unit onto the German positions of the Hindenburg Line where the London lads were going into action. And the village of Agny, that's up in this top left-hand corner, is where Edward Thomas is buried today. So this is a map that kind of chronicles the changes of a battlefield and shows that maps could be completely out of date by the time they were printed, and it shows why so many of these maps were printed, so many millions were printed, because they could sometimes need to be updated almost on a daily basis, particularly as the front is moving forward or moving backwards, depending on the period of the war. So again, just from one map, we've got the history of a part of the old front line on the Western Front. So the third of our maps, the final map that we're going to look at, I thought we'd move away from the Western Front. I do have some maps of Gallipoli, perhaps that's another chat for another day. But this one is a British trench map of Salonika, a part of the Salonika battlefields. Now, Salonika is a campaign that we haven't discussed enough on this podcast, and that's something I'm going to rectify in season 10 that's coming up from September onwards. This map, slightly smaller, it's a full-scale map. It's the full map itself. It's 1 to 20,000, so it's a different scale to the others. And it's produced not by the Ordnance Survey, because this is produced in theatre of war. It's produced by a survey company, Royal Engineers, BSF, British Salonika Force. And it's dated the 20th of August 1918. So it's towards the end of the campaign in Salonika. And it shows the amount of contours on here. Immediately when I look at this map, I can see we're looking at some difficult ground here compared to the flatness, the relative flatness of the Western Front. And a big chunk of the map up in the top right-hand corner is blue because that's Lake Dorian. And there's the town of Dorian, and this one doesn't show the British positions at all. There's not even a dotted line, I don't think, showing the actual British front line. It shows the positions that are in enemy hands. And it's got all of the kind of classic battlefield areas that when you go to Salonika today, you can go and visit. It's very much out in the wilderness. I can see distinct trench lines following the contours, belts of barbed wire, little crosses in front of them, denoting that they're protected by these belts of barbed wire. There's positions called the Scepter, the Hilt, there's the Sugarloaf, the Tongue, all of these kind of different locations which were features given names like this, reflecting in many cases what they look like or some associated name. And for most of the war, this has been a fairly static sector. This reflects the static nature of trench warfare on the Salonika front. Most of the men that fought here and became casualties were not necessarily killed or wounded by shell fire, mortars, or by bullets. It was the conditions. Disease was a massive problem on the Salonika front, and many of the men in these valleys and gullies which have rivers running through them and near to the lake, this was a malarial zone, so it was a great problem for the troops. And maps like this, again, as we've said, all of these three maps, they are part of the currency of history, the currency of the history of the Great War. They have similarities, they have differences, they tell us different things, and it shows that even just a piece of paper with some printed features on it and some additional information like the position of trenches and barbed wire and pillboxes and everything else, we can literally kind of unfold the history of these places through maps like these. And I'll put pictures of some of the sections of these three maps onto the podcast website, as I've said. And for Salonika, as I look here at Lake Dorian and the ground where the front lines were in 1918, this is a battlefield, this is a subject that we will return to soon. And having come away from those trench maps, what are the Blue Series maps that I used on that very first visit to the Somme in 1982? After all these years and with all this technology, what about them? Well, I still have them, or rather more recent replacements. I got through the originals probably a dozen times over, walking those battlefields in all weathers. Maps got wet, covered in snow, fell in the mud, and would eventually fall apart. And I often used to give maps away to people as well. First timers who'd come over, couldn't get to the map shops to buy them, I'd pass on that knowledge, and that's really important to do, passing on the knowledge through things like maps. And while I was an early adopter of the technology I've mentioned here, as I said, I first got Linesman in 2008, for me, none of it has really replaced paper maps. And I have an entire part of my bookshelves, I'm looking out to them now, where two bookshelves are standing together. The top section is narrow, and in there are dozens, if not hundreds, of maps from all over Europe and beyond, covering battlefields of both world wars. Whenever I go somewhere new, I always try and go to a local supermarket or a newsagent or even a map shop or a bookshop that's got maps and pick up maps of that area. And in some places, that is easier said than done. It's quite difficult in some countries to actually get maps. And while the gentleman who ran that Maison de la Presse where I bought my first Blue Series maps in Albert has long since retired, I'm pleased to say the shop itself is still there, still opposite the Basilica, still on that little corner in the square in the middle of Albert. And when I went back to the Somme for the first time after COVID, it felt like a renewal. And one of the things that I did was pop into that Maison de la Presse and bought the latest editions of the Blue Series maps. And I took them home and I drew the trench lines on them, and I did much of the same kind of detail. Battalions going into action on the 1st of July, where the divisional boundaries were, where headquarters, where concentrations of artillery were, all that kind of stuff. I perhaps added more than I'd ever done before. And this was, I guess, a continuation of everything that I'd done as a teenager all those years ago. So this is why maps are so important to me. Hopefully will become, if they not already are, as important to you as well, because these maps for me chart not just those pathways of the Great War, but a journey through my own life, really. Years and years of walking that ground, walking and exploring and understanding that old front line. I guess my old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.